In the previous webinar, we went through some of the factors that might explain why technologies did not meet market expectations. We also went through the stakeholders that play a critical role in the adoption of health technologies. And that I explained that the stakeholders are interested in evidence that goes beyond clinical data before deciding whether to use, prescribe, or pay for them. So today I would like to focus on the payer side and what is the role of eHTA and economic evaluation in this process of getting technologies paid by private and public payers. So specifically, I will go through why health technology assessment or eHTA exists. What is health technology assessment? What is an economic evaluation and its roles in the reimbursement process? And what are the key takeaway messages that we can take from this presentation? So, health technologies, drugs, medical devices, vaccines have been essential in optimizing care and improving our lives. Think about the impact of the smallpox vaccine, or anesthesia, or the discovery of antibiotics, insulin, or even more recently, the effects of the COVID-19 vaccine, and how with that we were able to see our friends and families again. So to give an example, before the measles vaccine, measles accounted for more than 3 million cases and more than 400 deaths every year in the United States. But after the vaccine, there was a 95% drop in cases, with the last outbreak just registering over 1,200 cases, mostly among unvaccinated with 0 casualties. And while some technologies will no doubtly provide major benefits to patients, most, in fact, will add little to no benefit to the patient population. So, for example, most drugs entering Canada have shown to add just small benefits over existing therapies. So between 2010 and 2018, one report showed that out of the 811 new products entering Canada, only 5% of them offered major benefits over existing therapies, and more than 80% of them just provided small benefits compared to existing treatment. And at the same time, many countries are already spending a lot of money in healthcare and health technologies. For example, Canada and the US spend more than 10% of their GDP in healthcare expenditures. Additionally, the drug spending per capita has increased over the years, with Canadians paying around $1,000, 114 per person, and the US paying around $1,000, $110 per person. So, given the situation of numerous drugs, devices, tests on the market, but limited resources, payers need a system in place to help them in the selection of treatments that will provide the most benefit within their budget. And that's where health technology assessment plays an important role. So health technology assessment, or eHTA, actually originated as a systematic approach to assess health technologies in the 70s in the United States. And I put it here in this slide, the standard definition of eHTA, which is a multidisciplinary process that uses explicit methods to determine the value of a health technology at different points in its life cycle. The purpose is to inform decision-making in order to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality health system. So what we can take it out from this definition is that one, eHTA is not a final decision. It helps to inform the final decision of the reimbursement process. And it's a multidisciplinary process. It may involve, for example, epidemiologists, clinicians, health economists, and sometimes even the patients. And here, when I speak about health technology assessment has been used to provide information on drugs, gene therapies, vaccines, diagnostic tests, but also on medical devices, procedures, health programs, and systems. And most high-income countries with a public healthcare system will have an established eHTA system, meaning they will have a national eHTA agency responsible for guiding coverage and pricing decisions. So countries like Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany are just some of the examples of countries with a history of an established eHTA system. And there has also been a push to implement eHTAs in middle-income countries like Brazil, South Africa, and Chile. But if you notice in this map, you will see that the US is an interesting story, because even though eHTA originated in the US, the country doesn't have a national eHTA agency that informs pricing and coverage decisions. However, that doesn't mean that eHTA and economic evaluation are not important in the country. On the contrary, there are many private insurers that will ask about economic evaluations from manufacturers or conduct their own eHTA. In addition, many organizations will use eHTAs and economic evaluations to inform their decisions. So, for example, the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, will use economic evaluations to inform their vaccination program. The American College of Cardiology is another example that will use economic evaluation to inform their clinical guidelines. And then you will have an agency for healthcare research and quality that will also conduct technology assessments to inform Medicaid and Medicare. And you will have the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER, that conducts quite a lot of eHTAs, which many payers will look at before deciding whether to reimburse for a therapy. So, in case we're still confused, let's take an example to illustrate how eHTA and economic evaluation plays a role in deciding whether to reimburse or not for a medication. So, spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, is a genetic rare condition affecting nerve cells, causing muscular weakness, muscle weakness, and atrophy. There are basically 4 subtypes of SMA, but the most common type of the disease affects children who may not be able to walk by themselves or may require permanent ventilation and may require assistance when eating or drinking. And in severe cases of the disease, babies with this condition will die before their 2nd birthday. But thanks to advances in research, the first treatment for SMA was approved in 2016. It's called Spinraza. So Spinraza has shown to be quite effective, but at the time it was considered one of the most expensive drugs, costing about $375,000 a year to treat a single patient. And that patient would require that treatment probably through their whole life. And then in 2019 came Zolgensma, developed by Novartis, and it was the first, and it is the only on the market, first gene therapy for SMA. It promises to be a one-time treatment, and studies suggested that patients taking this gene therapy increased muscle strain, and the therapy has shown to significantly improve survival. But it came with a price tag of $2 million, and it is, at the moment, the most expensive drug on the market. So, and let's say that you are a payer, right? Or you are the Canadian public healthcare system, and you look at Zolgensma that costs $2 million. But at the same time, you have other healthcare programs and other medications that are also competing for that money. So let's say if you had $2 million, which option would you choose? Would you choose Zolgensma to treat one child with SMA? Or maybe you will choose a PCSK9 inhibitor to lower cholesterol levels for 140 patients with cardiovascular disease. Or maybe you might be interested in using those $2 million to use Pap test to screen 20,000 patients for cervical cancer. So right now, there'll probably be a poll coming up at your screen. So I'll ask you for you guys to choose one option. Okay, so right now you guys might see the results here, and it's quite interesting. There's quite a lot of mix. Most of you chose the Pap test. Some of you said, well, I don't have any idea, may need more information. And there are some that actually chose Zolgensma over the others. Interesting. So now I'm going to ask, why? Why did you choose the option that you chose? And maybe you can tell me what are some of the criteria you chose when making that decision. And you can put it in the chat. And it can be anything, really. There's no right or wrong answer here. So just give a couple of minutes for people to hopefully write their responses in the chat. Okay, so while we wait, maybe you guys might don't have a clue why you chose, or oh, I guess it says here the chat is disabled. Okay. So yeah, so for example, yeah, thanks, Diana. So yeah, maybe you would consider evidence before making a decision. So you may just don't know, or yeah, or maybe it's because, well, thanks, Karen. Yeah, so maybe you chose Pap test because it would try to save as many people as possible. So you can see that if we don't have a process, then you would have an explicit process showing what actually needs to be taken into account by making a decision. Then a lot of people will come up with different values and criteria of which one to choose. And again, you might need more information to know exactly if Zolgensma is a better option than, for example, PCSK9 inhibitor or Pap test. So let's continue our presentation then. So again, eHTA looks at the multiple dimensions of an intervention to help payers make a decision. So, and that's why many agencies decided to conduct an eHTA on Zolgensma. And usually the eHTA process, we will start with the assessment. So basically the assessment is the evaluation of evidence. So in this step, evidence is collected, evaluated, and synthesized to inform the next stage. So in countries with an established eHTA agency, like Canada, and the United Kingdom, pharma or pharmaceutical companies will send a dossier with all of this evidence. And each country will have its own framework on how to conduct those assessments. But in general, these assessments will include information on the disease burden, description of the current care in that country, the unmet needs of the patient population. It will also include information on the technical properties of the technology, like the route of administration, if, for example, staff might need additional training to give that intervention, or the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of that technology. And eHTA can also include information on the ethical and legal and social aspects of implementing that technology. What are the consequences of implementing a technology, or what are the consequences of not implementing that technology are some of those aspects that are taken into consideration. It will also look at the risks associated or harms associated with the technology, but more importantly, the assessment will look at efficacy, effectiveness, and efficiency. So now let's take a closer look at those three E's, let's say. So efficacy, effectiveness, and efficiency help answer different but important policy questions, and they are taken into steps when developing evidence for your health technology. So the first step in assessing technologies is answering the question, can it work? And that is by looking at efficacy. So efficacy refers to the extent to which an intervention produces outcomes under ideal conditions. So ideal conditions meaning, for example, randomized clinical trials. Once that is established, the next step is to establish the effectiveness of a technology. So effectiveness refers to the extent to which an intervention produces outcomes in the real world. So it gives information on how well the technology works in normal practices. Because, for example, a drug can be quite efficacious in clinical trials, but not show the same results outside of them. Because, for example, patients might not go to the doctor often to change their dose, which what happens under rigorous clinical trials, or patients might not comply with the treatment, or they might they might not use the technology properly. And it is worth mentioning that people conducting eHTAs may look at evidence outside trials, since clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, may not have information, for example, on effectiveness relative to alternative treatments available in the country. So, for example, some technologies in RCTs might be conducted compared to placebo, when in fact there are other available alternatives in that particular setting. Or some of the issues that eHTAs might have when looking at trials is that trials use a lot of surrogate or biomarkers as outcome measures instead of clinical hard outcomes. But after effectiveness is established, the third step is to establish efficiency, which is the relationship between costs and benefits. It asks the question, is money well spent? And to answer the question, is that why we conduct economic evaluations? So what is an economic evaluation? So an economic evaluation basically analyzes the costs and consequences of alternative interventions given to a defined population. So in other words, it helps quantify which intervention provides the highest value for the cost associated. So let's go back and take a closer look at the economic evaluation conducted by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, CADTH, which is the agency responsible for conducting eHTAs for all provinces in Canada, apart from Quebec. So Quebec has its own agency that will conduct those kind of work. So the first step in an economic evaluation, like with other types of research, is to define your research question and targeted population. So in this case is Zolgensma cost-effective for patients with SMA type 1? And they decided to focus on SMA type 1 because it's the most common type of the disease, most severe. And they also looked at SMA type 1 at the time because it was the only subpopulation that the drug was approved. So, and the premises of these evaluations is, again, is to know what happens to patients after they receive treatment. And to fully understand the impact of the, and the consequences of the intervention once patients receive that is to follow them across their whole life. And then the next step of an economic evaluation is to identify the relevant alternatives to your intervention. So, and it's really important to choose the relevant alternatives, right? So it could be for your intervention, for example, that is another drug with a similar mechanism of action. But in some cases, it could be that the most meaningful alternative is, for example, a surgical procedure or just usual care. And again, so for example, in the case of Zolgensma was either Spinraza, which was the other available option, and also supportive care, because there are some cases where Spinraza was not available. Thus, no treatment or supportive care was a valid option in this case. Then, the evaluation looks at all costs accumulated over the years for each intervention. And it is important to notice when doing those economic analysis, it's not only about the cost of the technology itself. So it is not only about the cost of the drug or diagnostic test. It's all about the resources used over the years. So, for example, you might see that, for example, in the case of using Zolgensma, you might see a reduction in costs related to hospitalizations, procedures, because patients, for example, are feeling better. So that might reduce the cost of hospitalizations. Or for in other cases, that might be the case that you will see additional costs associated with additional adverse events. So patients might end up having some side effects because of the drugs and might end up going to the doctor more often, running some tests, and that also needs to be incorporated in your cost assessment. So in the case of Zolgensma, once they've conducted all those analyses, they found that for people taking Zolgensma, it would cost about 3.2 million Canadian dollars. Spinraza would actually cost more. In fact, would cost $4.9 million. And for patients in supportive care, it would cost about $137,000. And that's the cost. But as I said earlier, the other side of the economic evaluation is also looking at the consequences or health outcomes. And in economic evaluations, you usually choose one outcome measure to represent the benefits of that intervention. And that measure can be divided into two categories: natural units or quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. So what I mean by natural units is that basically any outcome that is meaningful to your target population or intervention. For example, when looking at gene therapy that improves survival, for example, in the case of Zolgensma, maybe the most meaningful outcome is the number of years life gain. Or maybe you are looking at PCSK9 inhibitor that lower cholesterol levels. In that case, the outcome measure of interest may be averted major cardiovascular event. So these are some of the outcome measures that you can use to quantify the benefits of your technology. But this measure can be quite limited, especially if you are a payer and looking at all of those numbers and you have to look at them before deciding whether to spend money on Zolgensma or somewhere else. So to illustrate that, so let's take a look at this example. And when you look at those options, which option do you think is more cost effective? Is it the PCSK9 inhibitor at a $250,000 per averted cardiovascular event? Or maybe Zolgensma at $400,000 per life years gain? Or inhaled insulin, which has a different outcome measure. So you might see a poll coming up at your screen. Okay, oh, that's quite interesting. Yeah, we have quite a split here. Yeah, almost equal. But yeah, and to be fair, this is just a question just for you guys to start thinking, right? Like, as you can see, like the answers were quite split because, well, it's hard to know which one is more effective when all the outcomes are measured different. And this is why people came up with a measure that could be used across different populations, different diseases, different technologies, and that's the quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. So QALYs is a summary outcome that combines the impact of gains in quality of life and quantity of life. It is often used in many economic evaluations, and in fact, countries like Canada, United Kingdom, and United States have adopted QALYs as an outcome measure for economic evaluations. And the advantage is that QALY not only takes into consideration quantity of life or survival, for example, but also the quality of life in the health state. So for example, if you have, let's say, new chemotherapies for cancer, you might have one that extends survival, but during that time, you might have serious side effects. You might end up in the hospital bed all the time, feeling noxious, fatigue, and the advantage of the QALY is that it takes into consideration the quality of life of the quality of life as well. So then it can help you to compare those different treatments that might have differences in survival and quality of life. So to calculate QALYs, what we basically do is to multiply the quality of life by the quantity of life. So quality of life is a scale going from 0, meaning dead, to 1, meaning perfect health. And the quantity of life is the length of years in the quality state. So let's just say that your current therapy, patients are expected to live 5 years with a quality of life of 0.6. So in that case, then your QALYs is 0.6 multiplied by 5, which is 3. And then let's say that you have a new treatment that extends your life to 10 years with a quality of life of 0.8. So in that case, 0.8 times 10 is 8. Thus, when you think about the QALYs gained, we would just put 8 minus 3 and end up with 5 QALYs. And that's how QALYs are calculated and used in economic evaluations. And I would like to point it out that even though qualies are often used in economic evaluations, they have received a lot of criticism over the years. And there are several limitations with qualies. I could spend a whole webinar just talking about that, but given that we don't have that time, I've just mentioned two that are all commonly described when using qualies. So the first one is really, the first one is that qualies, well, they failure to capture non-health related benefits. And what do I mean by that? So we are using qualies as a measure to measure the benefits of your technology. But many argue that there are other benefits that might be important to patients that are not well captured using qualies. So for example, maybe a benefit that an intervention brings is that patients are able to return to work faster or go to school or go and see their kids, for example, and that's not well reflected when using qualies. But the other criticism that people have regarding qualies is that qualies are considered equal regardless of the patient, regardless of the situation. So, for example, let's say one quality gain for a child using Zolgensma with a serious condition will be valued the same way as, for example, one quality gain of an adult with a mild headache. And should those situations be treated equal? So should one quality gain of a child be valued the same as one quality gain of an adult or of a senior? So these are the questions that people ask and and that's why they have criticized equality. Another example is like, should one quality gain of someone with a deadly condition be valued the same way as someone with a mild condition? So these are just some of the things that you might want to consider when thinking about qualities. But let's go back to the economic evaluation that we were doing with Zolgensma. So they calculated and they found that people after Zolgensma, the quality gain would be of 9.9, and with Espiraza, the quality would be 6.2, and in supportive care, the quality generated by that will be only 0.6. Now, once you have the costs and qualities, what we end up doing is that we calculate the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICER, is basically the summary of an economic evaluation. So it's the difference between costs divided by the differences in outcomes. And once you calculated that ICER, you end up using what we call the cost effectiveness plane to visualize where your technology is at in the economic evaluation. So this is the cost effectiveness plane. So basically, the plane consists of one axis measuring the effectiveness, the differences in effectiveness, and the other axis measuring the differences in costs. Ideally, you want your technology to be on this side of the cost effectiveness plane, highlighted in green, meaning that you have a technology that is more effective and less costly than the comparator. On the other hand, you also want to avoid technologies in the red area, because it means that your new technology is more costly and less effective than current therapies. So those situations are no-brainers for the payers, right? They will definitely pay for something that is more costly but less effective. More effective and less costly, but they also will refuse to pay for something that is more costly and less effective. Having said that, most technologies, will actually end up in this side of the plane, highlighted in blue, meaning that they are more costly than available therapies, but they are also more effective. So going back to Zolgensma, if you remember the findings and we compare Zolgensma with Inspiraza, we saw that Zolgensma, even though the drug itself costs more, it ended up costing less at the end than Inspiraza, but also being more effective than Inspiraza. So that's a no-brainer decision, right? It's more effective and less costly. But if we look at Zolgensma compared to supportive care, we may see that it is more costly than supportive care, but at the same time, it is more effective. So then we can calculate the ICER. And when we calculate the ICER, we found that compared to supportive care, Zolgensma has an incremental cost effectiveness ratio of $334,000 per QALY. So now you have that result. You might be wondering, well, but what does that mean? Is that good? Is that bad? So what usually happens is that many countries have established what we call a willingness to pay threshold. So it is a range of values that basically says that anything below that threshold can be considered cost effective, and everything above that threshold is considered not cost effective. So for example, countries like the United Kingdom have established a willingness to pay threshold in their economic guidelines. And the United Kingdom willingness to pay threshold ranges between £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY. The US and Canada has somewhat established their willingness to pay threshold. These are some of the values that are considered in their economic evaluations, but they're not as set in stone, I would say, as compared to the United States. So for example, Canada, in many economic evaluations conducted in Canada, the willingness to pay threshold oftentimes reported is around $50,000 per QALY. And in the United States, it usually ranges between $50,000 to $100,000 per QALY. And then, as you can see, for example, Zolgensma would, compared to supportive care, would be considered not cost effective. But that doesn't mean that payers will automatically refuse or reject that technology. So once an economic evaluation is done with the other evidence that is collected, then we move on to the appraisal part of the eHTA process. So in the appraisal step, usually what happens is that a committee is formed, and that committee varies between countries, but it usually consists of clinicians, clinical experts, health economists, policymakers. It might also include patients, and that committee will then look at the evidence and then, based on a set of criteria, make a final recommendation. And that recommendation usually falls under 3 categories. Do not provide technology, provide it, or provide under certain conditions. And once the eHTA report and recommendation is finalized, then it's disseminated to the payers, and then payers will use that recommendation to make a final decision on whether to reimburse for the new technology. And when you look at decisions, economic evaluation and eHTA play an important role in that decision, but there are just small factors, and there might be other factors that play an important role in the reimbursement process that might not be captured in the economic evaluation and eHTA. So factors like politics, price negotiation, physician support can also play a role in the final decision. So to understand a little bit more about that, for example, one study conducted in the United States looked at coverage restriction of orphan drugs in 17 health plans in the States. And that they found that as the ICER increased, the number of drugs with coverage restrictions also increased. But it's not there is not 100% correlation here. As you can see, there are some drugs that even though have a high ICER, they might still be fully covered by the health plan, meaning that there is some correlation, meaning that if you have a higher ICER, you might have a more difficult time in getting that drug fully covered. But there are other factors that are taken into consideration when making the final decision. So what can we conclude from all of this talk? Well, the key takeaway messages here is that eHTA is used to inform decision makers. Again, it's not the decision itself, and it's about the value of health technologies. Economic evaluations are used to quantify the costs and outcomes of alternative intervention, and the eHTA is a key component of the reimbursement decision. And now that I spoke about eHTA, you might be wondering, well, when should I start thinking about eHTA or even commercialization? And doing an eHTA, as you guys can see, requires a lot of work. There are a lot of evidence involved in doing an eHTA. You need data on effectiveness, cost effectiveness, safety, efficacy, the technical properties of your technology. And many of you might start thinking about doing an eHTA, or maybe start thinking about commercialization just at the end of clinical development, or once you have documents for regulatory review. And what we notice is that if you only start thinking about then after clinical trials, when most of your product is basically developed, then you might end up not collecting data during those trials that might be important for assessing cost effectiveness in the eHTA stage. Or you might end up with a technology of low unmet need or too costly for the benefit it brings. So shouldn't you start thinking about them, let's say now? And if so, what are some of the things that you must take into consideration if you start planning it now? And that's what we will cover in the next webinar. So these are just some of the references, and now I'm open to have a Q&A.
What do you think the most important considerations are when you're developing a new technology and deciding on those go, no go points? What are the early indicators that your technology or your health intervention might have a better chance as opposed to a weak chance of being approved by a government funding insurance, a government funded insurance plan?
Oh, that's a good question. And yeah, I think a lot of the times when we are doing research, we are caught up on the research and only think about whether we'll be able to move our findings to, for example, animal models, or just on the research itself, but forget about that, well, that there are other people involved in the space of the healthcare world, right? There are patients that you need to take in consideration, physicians, and also, as you said, payers. And I think in most cases, payers are often forgotten, right? Probably because we might not be familiar with these concepts. In fact, I think if you're not from health policy or HTA, you might not even know about HTA or reimbursement, and you might just hear sometimes on the news about politicians discussing whether or not to treat a condition, or you might hear for a lot of the rare diseases, you might hear sometimes on the news that provinces deny treatment for this very expensive drug to this baby, and that is just gives an uproar of, but there are a lot of things going behind that, and that if we don't take them into consideration early on, then you might have less chances of success in the later stages.
Okay, great, thanks. Anyone else that got any questions at this time, Leah?
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Anna Herman, who asks, how much does ethics play into it? Does it all become numbers and equations at some point when working in this field?
Wow, that's a great question, and I wish I had a very strong answer about it. Well, ethics, I think, plays a role in it. It is important. We don't know exactly how much, but we know, for example, let's say in rare diseases, it's just not about numbers, because, for example, a lot of drugs for rare diseases are very expensive. Take Zolgensma, for example. But it's not the only thing in consideration. For example, Zolgensma has been approved in many provinces to be used because, well, there is the ethical consideration that shouldn't we help support patients that otherwise wouldn't have treatment available to use because it's so expensive. So there are other considerations that play into a role. Ethics is one of them. I wish I could tell you exactly how much, but I think we don't know the answer yet.
Just maybe to add to that, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that the ultimate decisions are multi-criteria, that you take a lot of things in and are values-based. In the end, there is no correct answer to should you fund this, prioritize this type of patient versus this other type of patient that is reflects societal values. And, in fact, in some areas, like, for example, the orphan drugs, which Fernando was mentioning, NICE, which is the Health Technology Assessment Agency in the UK, does have it, for some, they've carved out some higher thresholds for ICERs, dollars per quality for some subtypes of patients where, for example, in rare disease, it's very hard to commercially charge lower prices because you have to in part recoup the R&D expenses, not always the case, but so that's one way in which things that ends up making it into that, but as well as all the other factors that that are both at the decision table, and then HTAs themselves also try to take into account not just the efficiency aspect, but also patient perspective, patient's experience, and other factors. But there's as Fernando was saying, there's no formula to bring it all together. It's ultimately a sort of social process.
Yes. All right. Thank you. And I know we're pretty much at time. Leah, do we have time for one brief question or not?
We can absolutely go over by a little bit of time. And we do have two questions at the moment.
Okay.
The first one is from Karen Chan, who asks a similar question to Anna. Do you know if medical ethics experts are also involved in these decisions in the Canadian healthcare system? Also, how should researchers access resources related to this topic?
Oh, okay. So, so there are the ethical component involved. For example, when doing the health technology assessments in Canada, and again, it's not only about medical ethics in the sense of clinical trials, for example. It involves more of the question, what would happen if I implement this intervention? On the other hand, what would happen if I don't reimburse for that intervention? So there are ethics involved, yes, in Canada. And for resources, I can, for example, there's CADIT, there is their website. I guess you can check it out if you want to look at reimbursement reviews. In Canada, there is also NICE, NICE, which is the one organization that conducts HTAs at the UK. And again, there's ICER, that is another great resource if you wanted to look at health technology assessments conducted in the United States. So just are some of those organizations that have websites, and you can check those resources out.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Leah, did you say there's one more question?
There is. Our final question is from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, how do you evaluate the improvement on the length of life or the benefits gained if it's a diagnostic technology instead of a curative technology?
Well, great question. But even with a diagnostic test, for example, because the economic evaluation is about assessing what happens to the patient, right? So you look at diagnostic tests, and I wish I had more time to talk about it, but basically you look at what would happen once the patient receives a positive or false positive, negative or false negative, and the consequences of that, what will be the costs and benefits involved in that process.